Section 10.3, using major scales to determine quality. So in the previous section, you learned that really important bit of information, that if you start on the first note of a major scale and you go up to another note that belongs to that major scale, then the quality of the interval is either going to be major or perfect. It's going to be major if it's a second, third, sixth, or seventh, and it's going to be perfect if it's a unison, fourth, fifth, or octave. So we now have a method, finally, for determining the full name of an interval. So first of all, as always, you're going to find the number, so count your lines and spaces. Then you're going to ask this question, which you will hear me ask a bazillion times. Does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? And if the answer is yes, in other words, the top note fits in the lower note's major scale, then the quality is either going to be perfect if it's a unison, fourth, fifth, or octave, or it's going to be major if it's a second, third, sixth, or seventh. So just like we learned in the last section. But if the answer is no, you're going to need to compare and adjust, and we're going to explain that as we look through many examples together. So let's start off pretty easy here. We're going to take this example from a C up to an A. Now let's follow the steps here. We're going to begin by counting our lines and spaces. So we count, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we know that it's an interval of a sixth, right? So we then, and in fact, at this point, you can even be thinking like, well, it could be major or minor. Yeah, in unlikely cases, it might be diminished or augmented. So you already have some guess, but let's officially figure it out. Does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? In other words, does A belong to the C major scale? Well, in C major, you just have the regular old white keys, right? You just have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, right? So of course, yes, A does belong to the C major scale. And because it does, then its quality, as we said way back up here, is either going to be perfect if it's a 1, 4, 5, or 8, or major if it's a 2, 3, 6, or 7. Well, it's a 6, right? So it's going to be indeed major. So our answer is major sixth. Now, isn't that satisfying? We can finally say with a great deal of confidence that this is indeed a major sixth. We're no longer guessing. Okay, now, they're not always going to be that easy, of course. Here's a related example. So C up to A flat. Okay, so count your slots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, of course, it's a sixth. And we're thinking, oh, maybe it's going to be major or minor, or it could be wacky and be diminished or augmented. But let's ask that question again. Does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? In other words, does A flat belong to the C major scale? And I mean particularly A flat itself, not another version of A, but A flat in particular. So does A flat belong to the C major scale? No. A C major scale looks like this, right? We have regular A in the C major scale. We do not have A flat. So the answer is no. Now we're going to get into that process of comparing and adjusting. So let's compare it to the sixth that is in the C major scale. So in a C major scale, of course, you have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. From C to A, that's what we're going to compare it to. So since in this case, does A belong to the C major scale? Well, of course it does, right? In fact, we figured that out in the last example. It is a major sixth from C to regular A. Now let's go back to the real world problem, which was C to A flat. So let's compare. Is C to A flat, is that interval, is that distance between the two notes, is that larger or smaller than what we have over here? Well, since we have an A flat, right, the top note is therefore a half step closer to the bottom note than regular A was. So the interval is smaller by a half step. Well, that's information that we can use, right? What is going to be smaller than a major sixth by a half step? Well, you learned this a few sections ago in the previous chapter. It is going to be a minor sixth, and we can say that definitively. Now, the best way to learn all this material is to look at a bunch of examples, so we're going to do a few more together. So let's do this one, E up to G sharp. Okay, so easy enough to determine the interval, right, or the number, I should say. You're going to get a third. So then you ask that all-important question, does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? Does G sharp belong to the E major scale? Well, this is where you need to conjure up in your head an E major scale, and I've written it out for you over here. E major has 4 sharps. Here is your E major scale written out. So is there a G sharp in the E major scale? Yes, there it is. There's the sharp from the key signature. And so the answer is yes, it does belong, which means that indeed it is a major third. All right, next page. We have an F up to a D sharp, and actually I didn't write it out as a harmonic interval. It's just a melodic interval, but same difference. Count your lines and spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's indeed a sixth. We ask that all-important question. Does D sharp belong to the F major scale? Does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? Well, here's our F major scale. Again, you should conjure this in your head. F major has one flat, which you should have memorized. And here are the notes of the F major scale, right? F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E, and F. So is there a D sharp in there? No. But what do we have in there that is close to it? We have a D natural, a regular D. So from F up to D, remember the D, yes, does belong to the F major scale. This has to be a major sixth. It satisfies that condition of the top note belonging to the bottom note's major scale. So that's important information. Let's go back to the real world over here. Is this interval, F to D sharp, is it larger or smaller than the interval that we were comparing it to? It's larger, right? D sharp is further away from F than regular D is. So it's larger by a half step. So what's larger than a half step, or larger by a half step, I should say, than a major sixth? An augmented sixth. And that's your answer for this one. Let's take a descending example. So we've got D flat down to G. Still calculate your number component the same way. So it's a fifth. We ask that question, does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? And yes, the top note comes first here. We're still dealing with top and bottom. Don't worry about the order so much. So does the top note, does the D flat belong to the G major scale? Here's where your knowledge of G major scales comes in handy. So the G major scale has one sharp, right? And the notes are G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and G. So does D flat belong? No. But regular D does, right? From G up to regular D is a perfect fifth because that D does belong indeed to the G major scale. So here's our lovely comparison example, perfect fifth. Now in the real world, we have something that is different, right? We have not G to D, but G to D flat. D flat is a lower pitch by a half step than regular D, so it is a half step closer to the bottom note, which means that this interval over here is smaller than this one over here, and it's smaller by exactly a half step. So what's smaller by a half step than a perfect fifth? A diminished fifth. All right, now let's do one slightly trickier example. This looks a little bit more like actual music, where we have a key signature here. So what we're going to do is just use the key signature to figure out what notes we're dealing with, but then we're going to use the same method as we've been using all along. So this key signature, of course, is telling us that we've got a B flat and E flat. We're probably in B flat major. I suppose we could be in G minor, which you'll learn about soon enough. But in any case, it's telling us that all B's are B flats and all E's are actually E flats. So the interval that we're dealing with is a C sharp up to an E flat because of the key signature. Now, once we've figured out exactly which notes we're dealing with, forget about that key signature. You're still going to use the bottom note as your point of reference. So you're going to ask that good old question, does E flat belong to the C sharp major scale? Does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? Well, here you have to conjure up your C sharp major scale, which of course has all 7 sharps, right? Your scale is C sharp, D sharp, E sharp, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, B sharp, C sharp. So is there an E flat in the C sharp major scale? Well, of course there's no E flat in the C sharp major scale. Far from it, right? What we actually have in the C sharp major scale, there's our C sharp, so we have an E sharp, right? And that interval is a major third because it fits in the major scale. What we have in the real world is not a C sharp to an E sharp, but a C sharp to an E flat. Well, let's figure this one out. So if a C sharp to an E sharp is a major third, right? That means that a C sharp to an E natural, I'm just going to write it as a regular E, that one is a half step smaller, right? Because the E is a little bit closer to the C sharp. That one's going to be your minor third, but that's still not what we want, right? A C sharp to an E flat, where we've made the top note get even closer to the bottom note, that, and I'm going to erase this thing right here to get it out of the way, That is, in fact, even smaller than minor, meaning it is diminished. So our answer here is a diminished third. Now let's maybe do one or two of these as examples. I encourage you to work these out. These are great practice problems for you to spend some time with. So let's take this first one, C up to F sharp. They start pretty easy and they get harder as you go along. So number 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's an interval of a fourth. We're expecting maybe perfect, but it could also be diminished or augmented. Ask that question. Does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? Does F sharp belong to the C major scale? Well, C major scale is just C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, right? So it does not belong. What we do know is that F belongs. C to F, because the F does belong to the C major scale, that has to be a perfect fourth, right? And what we have in the real world is C to F sharp. So C to F sharp, the distance between those two notes on the piano keyboard is bigger by a half step. So it is going to be not a perfect fourth, but an augmented fourth. Let's do maybe one more together. Let's do this G and this A. Let me clear off this top text. So from G to A, that's an interval of a second. So already we're thinking, well, it's probably minor or major, could be diminished or augmented, but let's figure it out now. Does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? Does A belong to the G major scale? G major has one sharp in it, right? So if you wrote out your G major scale, it would have all white notes except for an F sharp. So G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and G. Is there an A in the scale? Does A belong? Yeah, of course it does. It's right there. So since it belongs, and since it's a second, it is a major second. Let's maybe do one more example here, just because this one looks fun. So C flat down to F. Start by counting from the bottom up. And by the way, one of the reasons I have you count from the bottom up is to think already about that bottom note being the anchor. You always want to think of that bottom note as your point of reference, both when you're counting your slots and, as you've learned in this chapter, when you are figuring out the major scale to make use of. So we have an interval of a fifth. And what kind of fifth is it? Well, we think it's, there's a good chance that it's going to be perfect, could be diminished, could be augmented. So let's work it out. So does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? Does C flat belong to the F major scale? Well, what do we know about the F major scale? F major has one flat, which is B flat. So let me write this out again. Our notes of the F major scale are going to be these, right? F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E, F. So is there a C flat in the scale? No, it doesn't belong. But there's a regular C in the scale, right? So F to regular C has to be a perfect fifth. And what do we have in the real world? We have an interval that's just a half step smaller than that. So the C flat is just a half step closer to the F. So what's a half step smaller than a perfect? A diminished. So this is a diminished fifth from C flat down to F. So as always, please work out the rest of these and check your answers with the solutions manual.